Hello everyone, my name is Jade Roy, and today we're gonna talk about English Renaissance. So, the English Renaissance was a cultural and artistic movement in England from the early 16th century to the early 17th century. It is associated with the pan-European Renaissance that is usually regarded as beginning in Italy in the late 14th century. Renaissance styles and ideas, however, were slow to penetrate England and Elizabethan era in the second half of 16th century is usually regarded as the height of English Renaissance. The English Renaissance is different from the Italian Renaissance in the several ways. The dominant art forms of the English Renaissance were literature and music. Visual arts in the English Renaissance were much less significant than in the Italian Renaissance. The English period began far later than the Italian, which was moving into Mannerism and the Baroque by the 1550s or earlier. Okay, let's move on to literature. England had a strong tradition of literature in the English vernacular, which gradually increased as English use of the printing press became common by the mid 16th century. This tradition of literature written in English vernacular largely began with the Protestant Reformation's call to let people interpret the Bible for themselves, instead of accepting the Catholic Church interpretation. The desire to let people read the Bible for themselves led William Tyndale to publish his own translation in 1526. Another early proponent of literature in the vernacular was Roger Ascham, who was tutor to Princess Elizabeth during her teenage years, and is now often called the father of English prose. He proposed that the speech was the greatest gift to man from God, and to speak or write poorly was an affront. The peak of English drama and the theater is said to be the Elizabethan age, a golden age in English history where the arts, drama, and creative work flourished by the time of Elizabethan literature. All the plays of English Renaissance theater were the outstanding legacy of the period. The growing population of London, the growing wealth of its people, and their fondness for spectacle produced a dramatic literature of remarkable variety, quality, and extent. Genres of the period included the history play, which depicted English or European history. Philosophers and intellectuals included Thomas More and Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes wrote on empiricism and materialism, including scientific method and social contract. All the 16th century Tudor monarchs were highly educated, as was much of the nobility, and Italian literature had a considerable following, providing the source for many of Shakespeare's plays. English thought advanced toward modern science with the Baconian method. The language of the Book of Common Prayer, first published in 1549, and at the end of the period, the Bible had enduring the profound impact on the English consciousness. Okay, next part is visual art. England was slow to produce visual arts in Renaissance styles, and the artists of the Tudor court were mainly imported foreigners until after the end of the Renaissance. The English Reformation produced a huge program of iconoclasm that destroyed almost all medieval religious art, and all but ended the skill of painting in England. English art was to be dominated by the portrait paintings, and then later landscape art for centuries to come. The significant English invention was the portrait miniature, which essentially took the technique of the dyeing art of illuminating manuscript and transferred them to small portraits worn in laquettes. The portrait miniature had spread all over Europe by the 18th century. Later, portraits of Elizabeth layered the iconography of empire globes, crowns, swords, and columns, and representation of virginity and purity, such as moons and pearls, with classical illusion to present a complex story that conveyed to Elizabethan era viewers the majesty and significance of their virgin queen. The Amanda portrait is an allegorical panel painting depicting the queen surrounded by the symbol of empire against a backdrop representing the defeat of the Spanish Amanda in 1588. Okay, let's moving on to music. English Renaissance music kept in touch with the continental developments far from more than visual arts and managed to survive the Reformation relatively successfully, though William Bard and other major figures were Catholic. Lionel Power was an English composer of the late medieval and early Renaissance music eras. Along with John Dunstable, he was one of the major figures in English music in the early 15th century. Power is the composer best represented in the Old Hall manuscript. Power was one of the first composers to set separate movements of the ordinary of the Mass which were thematically unified and intended for contagious performance. He wrote Mass cycles, fragment and single movement, and a variety of other sacred works. John Dunstable was an English composer of polyphonic music of the late medieval era and early Renaissance periods. He was one of the most famous composers active in the early 15th century, a near contemporary of Power, and was widely influential not only in England but on the continent, especially in the developing style of the Burgundian school. The Italian and English Renaissance were similar in sharing a specific musical aesthetic. In the late 16th century, Italy was the musical center of Europe. In 1588, Nicholas Young published in England the Musica Transalpina, a collection of Italian madrigals that had been anglicized. Composers such as Thomas Morley, the only contemporary composer to set Shakespeare and whose work survives, published collections of their own, roughly in the Italian manner but yet with a unique Englishness. Interest in the compositions of the English madrigal school has enjoyed a considerable revival in the recent decades. And now let us move forward for the last part, which is architecture. Despite some buildings in a partly Renaissance style from the reign of Henry VIII, notably Hampton Court Palace, the vanished Nonsuch Palace, Sutton Place, and Layer Marney Tower. It was not until the Elizabethan architecture of the end of the century that a true Renaissance style emerged. Under Elizabeth, there's no new palaces, instead encouraging her courtiers to build extravagantly and house her on her summer progresses. A large number of small houses were built, and at the same time, many country mansions were constructed. Many of the earlier medieval or Tudor manors were remodeled and modernized during Elizabeth's reign. Civic and institutional buildings were also becoming increasingly common. The most famous buildings of a type called the Prodigy House are large show houses constructed for courtiers and characterized by lavish use of glass, as at Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall, Wallington Hall and Hatfield House and Burghley House, the style continuing into the early 17th century before developing into Jacobean architecture. Okay, next let's proceed to one of the authors during English Renaissance. John Ford. John Ford was an English playwright and poet of the Jacobean and Caroline eras. He was born in Islington in Devon, England. At 16 years old, John Ford of Devon was admitted to Exeter College, Oxford, on March 26, 1601. He joined an institution that was a prestigious law school but also a center of literary and dramatic activity, the Middle Temple. Prior to the start of his career as a playwright, Ford wrote other non-dramatic literary works: the long religious poem Christ's Bloody Sweat, the two prose essays published as pamphlets, The Golden Mean, and A Line of Life. After 1620, he began an active dramatic writing, first as a collaborator with the more experienced playwrights, primarily Thomas Dicker, but also John Webster and William Rowley, and by the later 1620s as a solo artist. Ford is best known for the tragedy Tis Pity, She's a War, a family drama with the plot lines of incest. He was a major playwright during the reign of George I. His plays deal with the conflict between individual passion and conscience and the laws and morals of society at large. Ford had a strong interest in abnormal psychology that is expressed through his dramas. The Lady's Trial is a Caroline-era stage play, a comedy by John Ford. Published in 1639, it was the last of Ford's play to appear in print and apparently the final work of Ford's dramatic career. The play was licensed for performance by Sir Henry Herbert, the Master of the Revels, on May 3, 1638. The quarto edition of the following years was issued by the bookseller Henry Shepherd, with a dedication by Ford to his personal friends Sir John Worley and his wife Mary, the illegitimate daughter of Sir Francis Whalley. As Ford's final play, The Lady's Trial departs from the patterns of his earlier works. It is more like the fashionable cavalier plays of the court dramatist. There is the play an artificiality and refinement not found in the earlier plays but pervasive in the court drama of the time. The Lady's Trial was written during the reign of George I. King George I had successive conflicts with the bridal choosing. The people of England did not favor a marriage between George I and a Spanish Habsburg princess, nor did they agree with a marriage between George I and Henrietta Maria of France. George I's life could have influenced John Ford's play, The Lady's Trial, because Prince Aurea similarly is conflicted with his people's rejections of potential queens of England. However, this is up for interpretation.